Former Arizona Governor Janet Napolitano was Anita Hill's attorney when Hill accused now Justice Clarence Thomas of sexual harassment during his nomination hearings 27 years ago. Napolitano, who is a Democrat, told 12 News today that she would not have voted to confirm Brett Kavanaugh. The former governor and Homeland Security Secretary under President Barack Obama said the U.S. Senate had made some strides in dealing with sexual harassment and assault allegations, but they still have a long way to go.
The majority members of the committee, who are all men, recognized that it was bad optics to have all men examining the woman, so they brought in Rachel Mitchell from the Maricopa County Attorney's Office. So there's some sensitivity there, but a lack of appreciation for sexual assault and how victims of sexual assault remember the trauma, but often don't remember details.
Napolitano, now president of the University of California, was in Phoenix campaigning for longtime staffer January Contreras, a Democrat who's running for Attorney General.